So this first part is the CCU Endorser Program 101. This is program overview. So basically what I'm going to be talking about tonight is very simply put in this agenda, what is the opportunity and how the Endorser Program can help us capture that opportunity. Now based on the polling, it sounds like about 2/3 of you have been working on endorsements, so some of this might be familiar to you, but if you're new to the program, we're going to start and really go from the ground up. So I always like to sort of start at the beginning and say, what does success look like for Citizens Climate Lobby? And of course, success for us looks like Congress acting on climate change. In order for that to happen, they need to see political will, and that's really why Citizens Climate Lobby exists. We focus on 3 primary levers of influence, we like to call them, to get Congress to act and to build that political will. So we do direct lobbying, and we write letters to our members of Congress. On the media front, we write op-eds and letters to the editor, things like that. And on the outreach side, for a long time, we really focused at the grassroots level, and we did a pretty good job there. But where we identified an opportunity to grow is at the grass tops level. This is community leaders, folks in the community that are visible and prominent in the community. Now, as CCL volunteers, we're always looking for statements on climate change. I mean, it's just what we do. So we tend to see statements all the time, whether it's from the business sector, faith, national security, or other. Here's some examples on the screen. In addition, we're always tending to be talking to people in the community. We're talking to leaders like folks in farm bureaus and service organizations, university presidents, business leaders, and others, and trying to develop relationships there. The challenge for us is that as CCL volunteers, we see political will every day, and we're trying to generate it every day and build relationships. But in order to capture that, the challenge for us is how do we engage these leaders both to expand our network, but also how do we evidence their support to the members of Congress? One of the challenges that I've always had before this program existed was figuring out, I know that there's a bunch of people in the district who support what we're doing, and there's folks who are very public about it, but when you've got 10 minutes in front of a member of Congress, how do you convey all that support? It's very difficult. Now, several attempts have been made to demonstrate that support, both within CCL and externally. Within CCL, we've, of course, always promoted newspaper editorials. We've developed documents like the oil company statements. We've had faith-based statements on climate change. Many of you have probably seen that. And several other efforts have been taken on to try to answer this question. Perhaps the most visible example within CCL was the South Florida Leaders Letter, which was done by CCL volunteer Jay Butera and his team in South Florida. Many of you have probably already heard this story, but it's certainly worth repeating because it really sets up the importance of this program pretty well. So one of the things that was done in South Florida, in addition to identifying constituents and building chapters there, they created the South Florida Leaders Letter. And what they did was they really built a coalition of business leaders, political leaders, university and research leaders from university presidents, things like that, and NGO and conservation groups. And they really built this conservation of leaders that signed on to this letter and physically joined Jay and his team as they met with members of Congress. And the way Jay tells it is he says that this is a game changer in the relationship with Congressman Curbela's office. And it really played a big role in gaining Congressman Curbela's signature on the Gibson resolution, which has been one of our greatest successes in Congress so far. So creating these local relationships really can change that relationship, and we'd like to repeat that all over the country. So taking all of the past efforts that have been done, all the discrete efforts, combining it with what Jay Butera has done, combining that with all the public position statements we see, we wanted to create a program to capture all of that and track it and support our volunteers to go generate more political will, bring it all together and present it to Congress. So that brings us to the definition of the Endorser Program. The Endorser Program supports CCL volunteers, chapters, and action teams to identify, cultivate, manage, and demonstrate political will from community leaders. This means either individuals or organizations. We refer to them as endorsers, to act on climate change. Support from the right endorser can significantly amplify our message to Congress. Endorsers can come in many types, for example, chambers of commerce, faith leaders, mayors, newspapers, local governments. Endorsements can come in many forms, such as our leaders letter, which we'll talk about in a minute, a city council resolution, a newspaper editorial. So that's how we define the endorser program. I really want to emphasize that it's really in a support function. It's here to support the local chapters. It's here to support the action teams. It's really the chapters and the action teams that do this outreach. The endorser program is here to provide the tools to keep it organized and facilitate. So that's really the role of the endorser program. Now, if you go into CCL Community and you go to Action Teams, you'll see the link to the endorser program homepage. And here's a screenshot of it on the left here. And really, it's broken out into 4 main categories, being, as we said before, identify. So this is identifying endorsers. 2 is cultivating the relationship. 3 is managing the support. So how do you manage a relationship? And then once you get a leader's letter signed, how do you manage that so that we can track it? And finally, demonstrate. How do we demonstrate that support to Congress? And that's how we'll structure the rest of this talk today. So for identify, there are a lot of the usual suspects, the obvious organizations and individuals that we would go after. At the chapter level, if you're working at your local level, we've already mentioned a lot of these. One great way to figure out who you should be pursuing is simply ask your member of Congress. They may have suggestions as to these are the folks that I listen to on energy issues and environment issues. So you might want to ask a member of Congress. But short of that, primary donors, faith leaders, leaders of other causes that are important to the member of Congress, elected officials, local elected officials like mayors and city council. We already talked about university presidents, chambers of commerce, etc. So there's lots of options at the local level. Some groups are working as a region. So across a state or across a region, you might pursue state politicians or influential industries in your region, large regional businesses, etc. And the action teams tend to focus more nationally. So this would be, for example, the Farm Bureau and Commodities Action Team, the Healthcare Action Team, the Conservative Caucus, Business Climate Leaders. There's a number of action teams, and a lot of those are really focused more at the national level. And so they engage think tanks, national media, large industry lobbying groups, large businesses, and opinion leaders that speak nationally. So, okay, once we've identified who we want to pursue, how do we cultivate that relationship, and what can the endorser program offer to help you do that? So this next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the targeted outreach section on CCL Community. We're going to walk through some of the leaders' letters and how you can collect signatures for those leaders' letters. We'll talk about the different types of the letters and actually collecting the signature. So starting with targeted outreach, if you're familiar with CCL Community, you might already be aware of this resource. If you click the Volunteer Resources button at the top, you go over to Outreach Resources on the left side, and then you scroll down, you'll see something called Targeted Outreach Resources. And these are specific pages for different types of potential endorsers. So working with folks in the academic community, the business community, conservative outreach, faith-based, etc. These really act as sort of the hub for targeted resources for different audiences. These continue to be refined. More information is going out there regularly, and a lot of these pages tend to be managed by the different action teams within CCL. So you're sort of getting the best practices from those teams. Okay, let's talk about the leaders' letters a little bit. So there are basically 4 leaders' letters that I'm going to present here. The first 2, many of you will be familiar with. So there's the Climate Action Leaders Letter. This is basically a leaders' letter to Congress. This is one letter nationally. It's the same letter. Everybody uses the same letter. One thing I point out here, the term endorsement letter is often used. We used that terminology early on. We've since abandoned that terminology, and the reason is that people hear endorsement and they think that they're endorsing Citizens Climate Lobby, which is not the case. This is a leader's letter to Congress. This is their letter. This is the endorser's letter to Congress. They sign on. We're just acting as the messenger. We're just carrying that message along to Congress, but this is their letter to the member of Congress, and they're not endorsing CCL, just to be clear about that. So the community leaders letter to Congress, this is calling for climate action. So basically it says, whereas climate change is a risk, therefore I support action on climate change is basically what this one says. The next leaders letter is the fee and dividend leaders letter. So this has a similar whereas clause, but the therefore statement calls for carbon fee and dividend. The third type of letter, this is something that we've newly introduced into the endorser database to be able to handle this, although it's not really a new concept. So what this is, occasionally the need has arisen for a specific letter in different parts of the country or for different reasons. So what these are custom letters created by CCL chapters, and some examples would include the South Florida Leaders Letter. Now, that one exists because it preceded the Endorser Program, so it existed before we did. But Michigan has done their own, North Carolina has done their own, Southern California has done their own, for example. Some are targeted at a specific audience. So, for example, the Higher Education Action Team is looking at doing their own experts letter where the wording is a little bit different, and it's really trying to make it more personalized for professors and experts that are climate scientists and so on. And then some also have a specific ask, for example, to support the Gibson resolution. Now, I will just make a few notes about this. Our preference is still to use the National Climate Action and CF&D letters. It's simpler, it's preferred just because it's more consistent. That being said, if the need does arise or you find it very useful to create a custom letter, be aware that it's going to be counted as a climate action letter. And what I mean by that is that when we generate reports, it's going to show up that the level of support is representative of climate action. So even if somebody signs a custom letter that says, I support fee and dividend, it's going to be counted only as climate action. The database, it gets complicated to do anything more than that, so that's the way we've built it. You can modify the whereas clauses. Again, this is if you want to do your own custom letter. You can modify the whereas clauses, but we're asking you to try to keep the therefore clause identical or nearly so to the climate action ask, so that, again, when we generate reports and we say that this person has signed a climate action letter, we can defend that position by saying, well, here's the language, it's a little bit different, but it's calling for the same thing. So just some notes of caution there if you're going to do a custom leaders letter. And the final thing, and I think this is very exciting, for those of you who have been paying attention recently or were in DC, you'll know that we are anticipating that we are going to have in 2017, we'll be introducing legislation. And so in preparation for that, we are anticipating that we're going to add a new leaders letter that would be specifically calling for support of our legislation. Once we introduce this letter, we're going to strongly urge endorser teams to make this their default ask. And we're also going to ask you to consider going back to endorsers that have already signed another letter and see if they'd be willing to sign on to this new letter. This, I think, is really exciting to me because what it means is that the work we're doing right now is going to be very important as we prepare for that. So what I would suggest is continue to work on getting as many leaders letters signed as possible and build those relationships. And next year when we have this new letter, it gives you a great opportunity to go back and say, okay, we now have legislation introduced. Can we talk about maybe having you sign this new updated letter? So I think that's really exciting. It's something that hopefully we'll introduce, well, as soon as we have legislation on the floor. So sooner better than later. Okay, so we've identified our potential endorser, we've cultivated the relationship, we've talked to them, we've built that relationship, they say, hey, I'm ready to sign on. So now you say, well, how do I physically get that signature and what do I do with it? So there's three options. First, many of you are familiar with the hard copy. So on CCL Community, you can print a PDF version of either letter, have it signed, scan it or take a photo and either upload it to the database directly or email it to endorse@citizensclimate.org and we'll put it in there for you. So the first option is the hard copy. The second option is to send an electronic personal invitation. Now this is from the endorser database. Once you've created that entry and the person is ready to receive the request, you can, through the database, send an automatic email to that endorser from the database, and they'll get text as shown on the screen. Or the third option is the leaders page. Now this is actually a resource that you might want to consider using in general. So if citizensclimatelobby.org/leaders gives a really nice description of what the Leaders Letter program is, why it's important, why we're seeking the person's support, what we're going to do with their signature if they do sign on. So it gives them a lot of good information. It answers some common questions. So you might want to use this resource regardless, even if you're not ready to collect a signature yet. However, if the person is ready to sign on, there's a little blue box there that says, count me in, I want to sign. And if they click that, they'll actually be taken to a form where they can fill in the information directly and go ahead and sign right on the spot. This is new. Before we didn't have this option where you could just go in and do an unsolicited sign-on, but we can do that now. One thing I'd warn is if you know that somebody's in the database already, if you've already added them and they go ahead and put this form in, that will create a duplicate entry. We can fix that, but it's a little cumbersome. So if you are asking somebody to go out here and you've already put them in the database, the preference would be to do option 2, which is to send them that electronic personal invitation. Also, if you do that, a lot of the fields will be filled in already. It'll make it easier for the endorser. But nevertheless, we have these 3 options. So option 1 is hard copy. Option 2, you can send a personal invitation, and when they click the link, a lot of the fields will be filled in already. And you will then the one who put that information in. And option 3 is people can sign sort of unsolicited. They can go ahead and sign directly. Okay, we've gotten the signature. Now how do we manage and track this relationship? How do we track all these endorsements? How do we track public position statements, etc.? That's all done through the endorser database, and it's a really elegant, very rich tool. It's got a lot of functionality. I suggest to people, as soon as you start identifying somebody to work with in the community, put them into the tool as quickly as you can, because one of the key things that the tool does for us is, A, it allows us to track how much all the great work that everybody's doing, but also it allows us to prevent duplicates from cropping up. So if somebody wants to reach out to a company, you might look and find that there's already what's called a delegate assigned. So the delegate is the CCL volunteer who works with an endorser. So, you know, you might want to reach out, for example, the example on the screen, you see Houston Junior Chamber of Commerce, and there's already a delegate assigned. So if somebody else wanted to engage that contact, they would say, oh, somebody's already working that, I should get in touch with that person. So I would recommend, you know, use the database, put new entries in here as quickly as you identify them. But there's going to be a lot more information about the database coming up in just a minute with the second part of this presentation tonight. And finally, once we get all the information into the database, what do we do with it? How do we then demonstrate that support to Congress? And there's 2 quick things that I'll show right now. For those of you who were at the national meeting, you would have seen potentially 2 documents. One was the National Climate Leaders. This was a 2-pager. It's kind of a summary of public position statements in a very condensed format. It had key topic or key categories like conservative thought leaders, energy industry, faith leaders, etc. In addition, so that was at the national level. In addition, there were state reports that were generated. If you were at the conference and you did not see this, it was perhaps because there weren't many endorsers from your state. So we sent these out to the state and regional coordinators. Some decided to share it with their volunteers, some didn't, based on how much was actually in there. But I think the plan, you know, going forward, we want to make these more readily available. So in the near future, we plan to have these more easily available. There's a lot of folks always asking for different types of reports. So we're going to try to offer more of these on CCL Community soon. And the final thing I'd point you to in terms of demonstrating support is on our public webpage, if you're not aware of this, citizensclimatelobby.org/endorsements. There, we are currently posting municipal resolutions and editorial endorsements. So that is a public page. It's something you can like and share on social media or reference for people. And again, currently it's municipal resolutions and editorials that may grow over time, but we are maintaining those 2 things up there right now. So with that, Ricky, I'm going to close it out and give control back to you.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I appreciate that. So we're going to take time. We got time for a couple of questions, and Peter and Tony, I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask these questions if you'll keep your answers brief as possible. We are just a little bit over on time right now. First question we got from Paul, and Paul asks, I've heard that form letters aren't really appreciated by members of Congress, yet you're telling us we should ask groups to send leaders letters, which is essentially a form letter. Why so?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a few differences to point out. Form letters can mean a few different things. One form letter is basically, something where an organization would send this letter out to all of their membership. So, this could be thousands of constituents. Those folks would put their name on it and send it in. That's bordering on like a petition, and you're right, the feedback we get is petitions, basically they don't show a very high level of commitment from a person to have to do that. So you're right, generally the petitions are not given a lot of weight. This is different for a couple of reasons. It's different, first of all, because we're really focused on community leaders, so the number by design is going to be fewer than that. Second of all, this really gives us an opportunity not to just go, and I probably didn't emphasize this enough in the talk, we're not looking to just kind of do this one and done where we go get a signature and we never talk to the person again. We really are looking to cultivate relationships with a lot of our endorsers. And so it's not just asking them to sign the letter, it's also asking them in some cases to join us for a meeting with a member of Congress, or to take a public position, or to do other things. So it is a little bit different, but that's a great point.
Great. Kathy asks as well, Peter or Tony, what about the possibility of including, ocean acidification as part of the, whereas part of one of our letters? I guess if she's thinking about customizing the letter for herself, would that be something that she could include, and not necessarily from a national point of view, but from her end?
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be in the category of the custom letter that we talked about before. If people have suggestions for alterations to the national letter, we're trying not to alter that too much, but every once in a while we might go back and revisit. So if you do have suggestions, you can email the program those suggestions. But as far as a custom letter, things like that, the whereas clause can really be whatever you want it to be. It should be something that's going to be relevant to that audience. So if you're, in your case, if you're working with scientists or working on ocean acidification, you can get pretty technical on the details as to why they would care about that. The key is that the therefore clause is consistent with the national letters.
Awesome. Okay, I think the other questions that we really have going on in the chat right now are really mostly around, we got one from Gwen, but the rest of them are around the database. So we're about to demonstrate the database. Tony's going to take us through about 20 minutes or so of database demonstration, so we'll do that. Just real quick, we have one last question about the program from Gwen. And Gwen asked, I have endorsements from small business owners. Are they grass tops, or should I wait for Chamber of Commerce?
Great question. Yeah, I think they're grass tops. When people ask the question, is this person a leader or not in the community? Sometimes it can be an awkward question of what counts. My answer to you would be anybody that you think would be particularly influential on your member of Congress is fair game. The great thing about local business leaders is once you get their support on the leaders letter, you can also go back to them and ask them to perhaps help you then approach the Chamber of Commerce. As businesses in the community. So again, there's a lot of ways to build and manage that relationship and leverage the strength of all those voices you're working on.